Let's talk about trimming in this lesson, where that is really when you begin to edit your media. And that can happen while you're previewing your footage. It can happen while you're looking at your footage here in the source window. And of course, it can happen down here in the sequence when you're building your movie. So let's talk about what it looks like to trim in your project window. We did talk about this in a previous lesson, so I'm going to go through this real quick. I'm going to double click on this video clips bin. I'll double click on that and I'm going to open it in a separate tab, and I'm going to make sure that the icon view has been selected, which it has been. And trimming can happen at this point while you're reviewing your media. So for instance, if I wanted to navigate up to any one of these clips, in fact, I'll use this clip right here as an example. As I hover my mouse over this icon, of course, I can scrub through the video, which is real handy. If I click on that clip, I can then mouse click and drag this playhead through the clip. Of course, I can push my spacebar to play the video, which is real handy. And I can actually mark in and out points. Now it looks like I've already marked an in and an out point here, but I'll update the out point here by pushing the letter O on my keyboard. And then I'll mouse click and I'll drag this playhead back over here to somewhere in the beginning, and I'll push the letter I to mark an in point. Well, that's basically a trim. I've just trimmed this clip now. And if I double click on that clip to open it up over in the source window, you can see the in and the out point that I created. And that's basically trimming here in the project window. Now, of course, I can navigate to a clip. Let's say, for instance, this clip here, I'll double click on that one and I'll load it into the source window. And I want to update this with new in and out markers. So I'll mouse click on the letter I to mark an in point on this particular clip, and then I'll drag the playhead over and push the letter O to mark an out point. That's basically trimming here in the source, and we did talk about that before as well. Trimming can happen in three different places. It can happen here in your project window, it can happen here in your source window, and it can happen, of course, down in your sequence. Now, as you're assembling your movie, you're going to quickly realize that you're going to want to trim at any given moment. And it typically happens when you're starting to build your movie and you want to trim the clips that are down in your sequence. And trimming down here is actually pretty straightforward. So I'm going to park my playhead over this first clip here, and I'll navigate to the very end of the clip, and notice that I get a red arrow. And depending on where I position my mouse, if I slightly move it to the right, the arrow will point in the different direction, indicating the direction of the trim. So if I want to trim the tail of this clip or the end of this clip and I want to bring it in, I'm going to use my playhead as a guide. I'll watch up in the program window as to where I want the new out point to be. And then I'll navigate to the end of the clip, I'll mouse click, and then I'll drag to trim. And then, of course, I'll have a gap. And while I was trimming, I can see up in the program window what I was trimming. And then if I want to get rid of this gap, I'll click on the gap and push delete on my keyboard, and that gets rid of the gap. Now, if I want to trim the head of this clip, I'll mouse click and I'll drag my playhead to the beginning of this clip. And the same thing will happen there. I'll go to the very beginning and notice how I have a red arrow pointing in the direction that I want to trim. I'll mouse click and I'll drag and I'll trim. That's pretty easy. Now, couple of quick caveats here. I'm going to get rid of that gap to begin with. I've been talking about the direction of the arrow and how it points left or right. What if I wanted to extend one of these clips? So for instance, I just shortened this clip, I trimmed it, but what if I want to extend this clip? Well, I could mouse click and create what I call a square lasso and move this group of clips out of the way by clicking and dragging out to the right. So then I could go to the tail of the clip, and even though the arrow is pointing to the left, I had to move these other clips out of the way in order to trim to the right, which would extend the clip, not shorten, okay? Because these clips were in the way. If I wanted to perform another type of trim, which is called a ripple edit, I show that to you in a different lesson, then I didn't have to move these clips. So for instance, I'm going to undo what I just did. There are 3 items here that I'm going to undo, or 2 items. I'll go back and make sure my selection tool is selected. If I mouse click and I want to drag to the right, I can't, because these other clips are in the way. And I don't know if you noticed, but there are triangles there that show up that are indicating I cannot move to the right. There's something in the way, which are these clips. So I could either A, mouse click and drag a square lasso to select everything to the right and move it over, and then mouse click and drag, because then of course that creates room. Or I could use the ripple tool, which if I show you real quick, I'm gonna just go through that real fast. In fact, let me set this up correctly. I'll navigate over to the ripple tool, mouse click, and then I get a different type of arrow. It's yellow now. So if I mouse click and drag to the right, then I can do that type of trim where I extend the clip and these clips move over to the right. Now, I go more into that ripple tool in a different lesson. I just wanted to quickly show you that trim just to kind of give you a little preview of what ripple editing is, because I explain ripple, roll, and then slip and slide in different lessons. So trimming by just simply navigating to the end of the clip, mouse clicking and dragging is pretty straightforward. I just shorten this clip, or I'll mouse click at the beginning of this clip and drag in, and I've shortened the head and the tail, or the beginning and the end of this clip. Then I can mouse click on the gap and then select it and push delete, and that gets rid of the gap. Now, there's another way to trim too. If I navigate over to the razor tool, I'll mouse click on that right there, the razor tool, and I could then mouse click on my playhead. I like using my playhead as a guide. Okay, so I'm going to mouse click and drag this over right about there. And let's say, for instance, I didn't want this footage from here to here. Well, if I use my razor tool to mouse click on that point where the playhead is, notice how it creates a cut. I'll use the letter V, or I'll push the letter V as a shortcut to get my selection tool back in what I would call my hand, which is really the cursor. And then I'll select that clip. And rather than just push delete, I'm going to push shift delete. And that not only gets rid of the excess footage that I don't want, but it closes the gap as well. So let's try that again. I'll go back and get my razor tool, mouse click on that. I'll use my playhead as a guide, maybe right about there. I'll then click on the media that I want to cut with the razor tool, push the letter V, and then I'll select the media that I don't want. Then I'll push shift delete, and it not only gets rid of the media, but it also gets rid of the gap as well. So another thing that I want to bring to your attention too is you may have noticed these little teeny triangles here at the end and the beginning of some clips. That basically means that, in fact, let me move this over. If there's a triangle here, in fact, let me move that over. If there's a triangle at the beginning or at the end, it doesn't really matter. That means you're at the physical end or the physical beginning of the media. So for instance, if I park my playhead over that clip and I double click on that to load it into the source, I can see here that I'm using down in my sequence as much of that media that is there. I'm using it down in the sequence, and they'll disappear when I trim. And I mouse click and I trim, they disappear, which indicates that I'm not at the physical beginning and the physical end of that media. And that's actually a good thing, because you'll want to see what's there so that you can place transitions between these clips, so that you can, for instance, if you want to dissolve from one clip to another, I highly recommend that you trim those clips so that you can dissolve from one clip to another. And I do talk about that too when I'm talking about transitions. So trimming is actually pretty straightforward when it comes to doing that down in the sequence, up in the source window, or over here in your project window when you have the icon view selected. So we covered a lot of good stuff in this lesson. Try that in practice, and I'm certain you'll find all three of those methods very handy as you're editing. And when you're ready, you're then ready to move on to the next lesson.